thank you all for being here today. We have a terrific panel to talk about Section 230 and some of the challenges around it and really what's at stake with the many efforts to try to amend Section 230. And it's going to be a good panel. I'm very excited about it. So let me introduce our panelists. I'm not going to say to my left, my right, because it's probably different on your screen, but we'll just give it a whirl. Our first panelist is former Congressman Chris Cox, who is also the former chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. He was a Republican member of the United States House of Representatives for 17 years and was also a member of the White House staff in the Reagan administration. He currently serves as counsel to the international law firm of Morgan, Lewis, and Bockius. Christy Barnhart, maybe you guys could raise your hand so people will know who you are. There you go. There's Chris Cox, there's Christy Barnhart. Is senior counsel for communications and technology policy for U.S. Senator Brian Schatz. Before coming to the Senate, Christy was vice president of regulatory affairs at Charter Communications. Prior to joining Charter, Christy held several leadership roles in the Federal Communications Commission, and she was there when I was there, and I really enjoyed working with her. Daphne Keller directs the program on platform regulation at Stanford Law School's Cyber Policy Center. And she was formerly the director of intermediary liability at the Center for Internet and Society, which is also at Stanford Law School. Her work focuses on platform regulation and internet users' rights. Until 2015, Daphne was Associate General Counsel for Google, where she had the primary responsibility for the company's search products. And I remember Daphne when she was a very, very young academic at Duke. We worked together on copyright issues. So it's great to see you, Daphne. Finally, we have Emma Llansó, who is the director of CDT's Free Expression Project, which works to promote law and policy that support internet users' free expression rights in the United States and around the world. The project's work spans many subjects, including human trafficking, privacy and online reputation issues, counterterrorism, and radicalizing content disinformation and online harassment. So obviously a very, very broad portfolio, and Emma, it's great to see you. So let's start right off the bat with one of the authors of Section 230, Congressman Cox. Can you tell us a little about your thinking when you decided to draft Section 230, or what would become Section 230, and what you hoped it would accomplish?
Yes, it's a while back, 1995. In the spring of 1995, in a serendipitous way, what really set all of this in train was that Ron Wyden, now a senator from Oregon, then a House member, and I were having lunch in the members' private dining room in the Capitol, and we were commiserating with one another that as we looked around the room, all the Democrats were eating with all the Democrats and all the Republicans were eating with all the Republicans, and it was really quite a segregated place. And this was back in '95. It's much more partisan now, but we were shocked and saddened that this is the way that it was then. And so we resolved to look for ways that we could work across the aisle on things together. And we decided that the best way to do that would be to focus on forward-looking issues, not the issues where everybody already made up their minds and had a knee-jerk response. A month or so later, I was flying back to DC on my weekly commute from California, reading the newspaper, and I read about a court case in New York that had done something to me astonishing and wrong. They had decided that Prodigy, which was then one of the leading not only service providers but also portals on the internet, was going to be liable in a defamation suit for what its users had posted on their site. And this was a different and opposite result from an earlier New York case involving CompuServe, a similar service. I was then a subscriber to both of them, in which CompuServe was held harmless from liability. And the difference between Prodigy and CompuServe was just one thing, and that is that Prodigy attempted to moderate content on its site and CompuServe did not. So the result of this case was that internet platforms faced a terrible dilemma. If they attempted to enforce even minimal rules of the road in order to maintain civility and keep their sites free from obscenity and obnoxious behavior, they'd become unlimitedly liable for all of the user-created content on their site. On the other hand, if the website followed an anything goes business model with no content moderation whatsoever, then it could completely avoid that liability. From the perspective of any internet platform that attempted to maintain a family-friendly site, there was a clear message. It was a classic case of no good deed goes unpunished. So thinking that this was a terrible precedent, I decided to do something about it. By the time my plane landed, I'd completed the first draft of a bill to eliminate the perverse incentive for anything goes. And it imposed liability on criminals and tortfeasors for their own wrongful communications and conduct, rather than shifting that liability to a website that did not in any way participate in the wrongdoing. And in so doing, it freed each website to clean up its corner of the internet, so that no longer would be being a good Samaritan by trouble. When I got back to DC, remembering our lunch, I recruited Ron Wyden as my first co-sponsor, and we set to work. Shortly after that, in the summer of 1996, a little-known Democrat from Nebraska, James Exxon, brought to the Senate floor his bill that would be the first ever to regulate content on the internet, and it was the polar opposite of what Ron and I had set out to do. He called his bill the Communications Decency Act, and it was heavily regulatory, so much so that I don't think it could ever have worked. Under his approach, not only would the content creator, the person who posted the article or the image that was unsuitable for minors, face jail and fines, the bill made the mere transmission of such content criminal as well. And meanwhile, internet service providers would be exempted from civil or criminal liability only for the limited purpose of eavesdropping on their customers' email in order to prevent the transmission of potentially offensive material. So there were big differences between the Exxon approach and our approach. And what we set out to do was to stop Exxon. He had gotten a big vote in the Senate. By the time we had our chance in the House, it was almost unanimous in the Senate in favor of Exxon. Everybody thought that was that. But when it came to the House, Ron and I also got an almost unanimous vote on the House floor from Democrats and Republicans who spoke directly to what Exxon had tried to do, said they thought that was the wrong approach because it didn't understand the technology. And that's really how Section 230 was born. Fast forward all the way through passage of the Telecommunications Bill. A year later, in 1996, the Cox-Wyden bill got attached to that as an amendment. When it went to conference with the Senate already had Exxon in there, and they didn't want to take it out because almost all the senators had voted for it. 96 was an election year. You don't want to be on both sides of the same issue when Exxon had framed it as a vote about pornography. And so in one of those classic Washington compromises, they put both of us in. The Cox-Wyden bill, the Exxon bill, it was really a command to the regulated community to simultaneously walk north and south. Made no sense at all. But the Supreme Court eventually ended up rationalizing this by knocking Exxon out, declaring it unconstitutional, mostly on First Amendment grounds. And so we won in the Supreme Court what we did not win in conference. My only disappointment is that Section 230 of the Communications Act is also known as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That was his bill, not ours, but that's just a footnote.
So let's fast forward to now. And Section 230 has really kind of risen in people's minds, and that's partially, or say largely, because of some controversial decisions on content moderation that have been made by the biggest tech companies. So Christy, let me ask you, what do you see as the biggest problems, if any, with Section 230 today? And what in your mind would be the best way to move forward in solving them? Legislation, obviously you're a legislator, right? You work for a legislator, FCC rulemaking, industry best practices, and then I'm going to open it up to some of the other panelists to also answer that question. But Christy, I want to start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Gigi, and thanks to Encompass for having me here with this great group of panelists. I'm really excited about this conversation that we're about to have. So I think that in the discussion around Congress about Section 230, I think that unfortunately Section 230 is often used as a label for a lot of different concerns that people have with the internet, whether it's privacy, whether it's the size of these companies and their economic power. And then there's also, content moderation. And so what I have seen in my perch where I am right now is that there's a kind of a scattershot method when you're talking about Section 230 and how you're looking to amend the bill to fit the concerns of that particular legislator. When we drafted the Pact Act, our concern and what we were the most concerned about was trying to make sure that content moderation wasn't a black box, that there wasn't a invisible set of guidelines that platforms were using to determine whether or not content was suitable for their site. And so the focus of the Pact Act is trying to provide more transparency in that for users, and also some accountability, not necessarily to you have to have this in your content moderation practices, but that there's some accountability to consumers that when they flag something is happening, that the content platform, the online platform is being responsive to that. And I think, focusing on those things, accountability to consumers and also transparency would help go a long way with some of the other discussions that we have about the unfair application of content moderation policies by platforms, which is what some of the discussion has been in Congress about Section 230. And so for those reasons, I think that really the debate should be in Capitol Hill. It should be in Congress. I know that the FCC is looking at it, but there are many different proposals that right now Congress is determining. The bill that that my boss, wrote with Senator Thune, the Pact Act, as I just mentioned, is one of them. And so I think that there is a role for Congress to actually take a look at Section 230 and possibly amend it. There's also a role, though, I think, for industry to work together and think about best practices. And one other thing that I think we hear a lot about is the perceived failure of platforms to communicate with each other in a way that can make sure that some of the most egregious types of content come down and stay down. And I think that there is a lot of interest in trying to figure out how to make that more of an activity for large platforms, but also small platforms, and how to push down that knowledge and that technical expertise down so that we can have a place where we're not continually trying to take down things that have already been taken down 100 or 200 times that are particularly egregious.
Yeah, I want to get to the FCC and their petition in just a moment, but since you raised the Pact Act, I'm gonna pitch it over to Daphne, who called the Pact Act, I'm gonna quote, "a list of serious ideas imperfectly executed," which for Daphne, understand, is high praise for a piece of legislation on Section 230. So Daphne, you talk about where, sort of where your critique comes from. Also maybe fold in my last question, what do you think are some of the possibilities for moving forward on content moderation / Section 230 issues? And what you think sets the Pact Act? There are so many legislative proposals. What do you think sets it apart from the rest?
There really are so many proposals out there. And I think what sets the Pact Act apart is that it's realistic about the fact that what we're talking about is the operational logistics of just vast content moderation efforts. And so I would contrast it with proposals like one portion of the Earn It Act, which suggests that you might preserve your 230 immunity if you behaved reasonably. There are ideas out there that we can set a fuzzy word like reasonable and then let the courts sort it all out. Realistically, the number of companies that depend on CDA 230, and not just the usual suspect, the YouTubes and the Twitters, but the companies the congressman mentioned in his testimony a while back, the online retailers that depend on 230 to let consumers review products, the newspapers that let users comment on stories, all of these companies are depending on 230, and none of them know what a vague standard like reasonableness means for them. And that leaves them in a position where the safest thing to do is to just take content down anytime it could possibly pose a risk to them. So that creates both a threat to user speech and an economic threat to, you know, smaller competitors trying to compete with today's platforms, or smaller companies that are depending on 230. So the great thing about Pact, and something that I think Christy and her colleagues just did a very good job of thinking through and working on for a long time and getting into the details, is it gets away from the idea that, like, oh, you know, just be good and the courts will sort it out, and says instead, here's a process to follow. And the process has, for illegal content, for example, the idea that if there's something illegal, you go and you get a court to adjudicate it as illegal rather than having a platform make that determination. And then there's a clear process to bring the order to the platform. It's a very long act, so I won't describe everything in it. But the good thing is that it focuses on these operational steps so that the platforms can have certainty, so that consumers can have certainty, and so forth. Where I think there's need for improvement is just in the details of those steps. And it's not surprising that, that there's room for improvement, because this is an area that there just aren't that many people with experience in the trust and safety operational world who are around to, you know, lend their voice to the process. And so I hope that as we continue to discuss proposals like Pact, we'll get maybe organizations like the new Trust and Safety Professionals Association, you know, other people who just know the nuts and bolts of this, to come and talk more about things like, well, is 24 hours to take down content a reasonable amount of time, or should it be different? You know, what should be the threshold for which size of company has which kind of obligations? But, you know, those are details. Those are things we can talk through. But I think it's a real sign of maturing in the CDA 230 conversation that Pact focuses on those details at all.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think it's really important to point out the differential in the impact of some of these proposals on smaller entities than on larger entities. The Facebooks and the Googles of the world, they can handle taking down tons of content, but some of the smaller entities can't. Well, Emma, let me bring you into the conversation. You know, supporters of Section 230 say it's been, you know, really vital to free expression online. You know, consumers now have an opportunity to be heard. I mean, look, I'm dating myself, but I grew up in the broadcasting and cable era, trying to get broadcasters to open up their airwaves to differing viewpoints and such. And it was a colossal failure, of course, but now you have the internet, which actually allows for this. So what are some of your thoughts and concerns about some of the ideas for amending Section 230 and how they might affect free expression online?
Sure, yeah. So I think one thing that's really important to understand when we're talking about any issue about online content and people's speech is that we really have to think about the enormous scale of content that different intermediaries are dealing with. And it's a scale that kind of grows. Scale is an issue for small platforms. Scale is an issue for a platform like Facebook with 2 billion users. It's not sort of an issue that comes in later once an entity is really well established. A solo proprietor of a single message board can get an overwhelming to them number of messages kind of posted on their service in a day. So this really goes to the point about certainty that Daphne was just talking about. The thing that Section 230 brings to all of the different intermediaries that we use to communicate on the internet, to post our views, to exchange information with each other, they all depend on having a really strong and clear legal framework that ensures that, by and large, they are not going to end up in court defending their decision to having posted or linked to or provided as a search result or provided a domain name to some kind of illegal user speech. And when content is uploaded to these services or passed over them, there's no way before it's uploaded to know that, oh, this is the post that's going to be illegal and these are the 10 million that are perfectly fine. So having a kind of a really clear and stable legal framework has been essential to people being able to use the internet and all of the intermediaries that make it up for their speech. When we start talking about amending Section 230, that starts bringing in questions and kind of potentially destabilizing that framework. That's not to say that it has to look exactly the same as it does right now forever. And indeed, most other countries have other legal frameworks. For example, in Europe, there is more of a notice and action approach to dealing with illegal content that shares some similarities with the US DMCA, but we don't have to get into that in great detail. Just suffice to say that the 230 approach to kind of a very clear and strong blanket immunity from suit, essentially, is not the only way to skin the cat, but it is one that we have built a lot of speech and a lot of businesses on top of. So when we look at bringing in any changes to the 230 framework, for me, the first thing I always look at is, will it be able to leave intermediaries with roughly the same level of certainty about when they might get sued for what their users are doing or not? And if there's a question, or as Daphne was saying, if there is a part of the law that says, well, actually, if you, the content host, get sued, you're going to have to go through discovery in the lawsuit to prove that you had a good faith intention when you took this content down, or to prove that you were reasonable in how you ran your content moderation service. Suddenly, we're totally changing the dynamic of what it means for the technical intermediary to handle user speech. And I think at the end of the day, if it's risky for an intermediary to deal with user speech, they're just not going to. They're going to block, they're going to take content down. We've seen this actually in the kind of fallout from Sesta Fosta being passed a couple of years ago. This was the first major amendment to Section 230 since the bill was passed as part of the 96 Telecom Act. And one of the immediate responses that we saw from different service providers were closing down different forums, closing down different accounts, and really saying, in that case, Sesta Fosta was dealing with issues related to sex trafficking, so a very illegal activity. But we saw providers respond by shutting down forums that were not about sex trafficking and were not kind of havens for them, but that the providers thought, you know, the content that gets posted here might take us too close to the line of what is now prohibited under this law and where the intermediary now has liability. So rather than take that risk, they just closed down the forums.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear pretty much, well, I want to hear from Congressman Cox about this, but several people on the panel, almost everybody on the panel, saying that they don't think that that it's impossible to amend Section 230, which is, I think, something that, I don't often hear, at least on some of the lists that I'm at. There's a set number of people who think it's completely inviolable and you could never touch it, but I'm not hearing that here. But I want to get to you, Congressman Cox, back to you. I mean, what are your thoughts? Has Section 230 evolved in a way you didn't anticipate? Is it in need of some, I would call it modernizing at this point, given where we are? I mean, obviously the internet is so different now than it was in 1996 and 1997. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I often hear that Section 230 was enacted way back in the 90s when the internet was so radically different from today, as facilitation of an infant industry. And of course, this infant industry argument has echoes in the law in other ways, in antitrust and other places. But I assure you that Ron Wyden and I had nothing of the sort in mind when we authored the legislation. That's not why we did it. And in fact, the infancy of the internet, in my way of thinking, cuts the other way in terms of understanding whether 230 is needed more or less today than it was then. The problem that internet portals faced in the 90s was that, unlike broadcast, where a radio or a newspaper or a television station, were looking at passive consumers of their product, and they had a finite amount of information that they were passing on to those consumers. The difference here was that the publishers were all of the users. They were all themselves content creators, and they all converged on a single portal. So the portal would be overwhelmed if it had to take responsibility for all of that content. But back then, the content was measured in millions. Today, it's measured, exponentially larger. There's just no way that technology, even artificial intelligence and algorithms, is going to do a great job of filtering speech in a way that would be legally sufficiently rigorous for them to avoid liability and still satisfy free speech advocates who don't want content taken down willy-nilly. So the problem of the convergence of many on one is greater now because of the scale of the internet than it was then. So that's thing one. Thing two is that there have been divergent court decisions, and some of the complaints about Section 230 arise from the outlier, what I think of as outlier court decisions that are inconsistent with the statutory language and that are inconsistent with what commonsensically we would all like to see, which is that illegal activity is punished. I think the most notorious instance in recent times has been the litigation around Backpage.com, which was an online business model designed to profit from illegal prostitution and sex trafficking. There was not much question what was going on there. Everybody saw it. And yet in the First Circuit and in the trial court there within the First Circuit, the court said, gee, there's nothing we can do about this because of Section 230. And I think it was a complete misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the statute. It completely ignored the definition in the statute that says that anyone, including a website, can be an information content provider if they are responsible in whole or in part for the creation or development of online content. And if a website's posting rules facilitate the development of illegal content, then the website becomes a content provider in its own right. The First Circuit somehow decided otherwise, at least temporarily. Finally, that got sorted out even within the First Circuit in a 2018 decision in related Backpage litigation. But because Backpage was so notorious, it created quite a firestorm in the country and on Capitol Hill, resulted in the passage of Sesta Fosta. Ironically, Sesta Fosta wasn't needed to bring down Backpage because the feds did it just before that law even went into effect. But those are the kinds of things that I don't know whether I can say I didn't anticipate that some courts would interpret a bill that I wrote that became law differently than I would have intended, because that's no member of Congress has that protection. But clearly it's a divergence from what we intended, from what Ron and I intended, and I think what Congress intended when it passed the law.
So Daphne, let me just turn it over to you then on this point. I mean, is there anything that you think Congress could do to resolve some of these problems with courts just interpreting the law improperly, or that's just the nature of the courts? And when is the Supreme Court going to take up a Section 230 case?
Well, there's one. There's a case on petition for cert right now, but it's, well, at least one, maybe there's more than one. The Malwarebytes out of the Ninth Circuit poses an interesting question about the sort of freedom to decide what should be blocked. But in terms of, what can be done in the law, I think there's an idea that is widely held that's worth really focusing on and debunking, which is that either that 230 requires platforms to be neutral in order to benefit from the immunity, or that it should. That we should have a dichotomy where either you are a publisher or you are a common carrier. And if you're a publisher, you're totally responsible for everything your users post, and otherwise you don't intervene at all, and you just let the content flow freely. And I think, I actually have a Washington Post editorial on this from 6 months or so ago. I think that's a very intuitive framing to a lot of people, precisely because I think all of us grew up in the, the broadcast and cable era, where everyone's either, AT&T and being a common carrier, or they're Walter Cronkite, and they have lawyers vet every single word that they say before they say it. But that's not the world that the internet gave us, and it's not the world that most people want. I think most people, and there's Gallup polling to support this, most people like that we can all go to Twitter and share our political opinions. We can all go to Facebook and share our baby pictures, and there isn't a cadre of platform lawyers waiting to vet it and make sure it's legal. The platforms are able to operate in a world where they can have policies and try to enforce them and try to create a world of civil discourse, but at the same time, they don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be on the hook for every word their users say. So this is the world that CVA 230 gave us, and it is I think, much better world than one in which every platform has to either have lawyers vet every single word and be Walter Cronkite, or let all of the garbage flow freely because they're a common carrier. One other thing I would add, and this is just following up on Emma's point from earlier, is, if we think about these smaller platforms deciding what to do in the face of new liability, there's a really interesting study from Engine, the startup advocacy group, just showing without 230, how much money does it cost you to get rid of a lawsuit? Like, even if you're gonna win, there's no merit to the lawsuit, but depending on what stage you prevail at, it racks up very quickly. It costs you $10,000, $30,000, $80,000, $100,000 every single time somebody brings even a wrongful allegation that something is illegal. And those are just numbers that no small business can tolerate. And so their options are to take down way too much content, to get out of the business of hosting that content, or to rack up intolerable expenses. And that's, I think, a really important framing as we think about options with 230.
I actually want to pitch that over back to Christy about whether that kind of sensitivity is something that your boss is thinking about, as you move forward with the Pact Act. Is the differential impact on the smaller players?
It is something that we've thought a lot about. And I think the point that Daphne just raised about, and others on this panel have raised about, the important opportunity that the internet has provided for smaller voices, for dissident voices, to be able to put out information and content that may not have gotten as much attraction, in the media environment before today, right? And I think the challenges in amending Section 230 is ensuring that you are offering more, you're offering consumers more ability to flag and make platforms aware of content that is clearly objectionable and make them take action, but at the same time not diminish the important ability of platforms and the important way that platforms can disseminate so much information so much easier and so much faster. And I think, Section 230, it really is emblematic of democratic discourse in the United States. And it has sort of been imported around the world. Like, you can put something out on the internet and get support. And that is something that has been great as American companies, like many of these online platforms, that have been adopted other places. So that's an important aspect, I think, of our online world that we don't want to lose. At the same time, however, some platforms have hidden behind Section 230 and taken a point of view that they don't have any responsibility for what's on their site. And, and they don't want to do any content moderation, particularly when it comes to things that arguably have been maybe defamatory, or they may be using Section 230 in a federal investigation under civil law. And so there are aspects where Section 230 we think is being used too far as a defense, and we tried to rein that in a bit under the Pact Act. But the point that Section 230 provides an important protection for for smaller voices and is a valid one, and something that I think we all need to take a look at and consider and value as we look to amend the law.
So let me raise then, oh, go ahead, Emma, you want to say something, please.
Sure, just on this question about kind of what Congress should be thinking about and looking at is just a caution, I would say, and something that actually ties back to the original Communications Decency Act, which, as Representative Cox mentioned, the vast majority of that bill was struck down by the Supreme Court for being a violation of the First Amendment, is that Congress needs to keep focused on illegal material. And that's one thing that can get kind of lost as we talk about content moderation writ large, because in general, the vast amount of information that ever gets taken down on an online service isn't coming because someone obtained a court order or someone has pursued some sort of legal process to determine this content actually violated the law. It's coming under companies' content moderation systems, which can address illegal content, but also speech that is lawful and constitutionally protected. And a lot of some of the most difficult challenges that we're facing with online content today are things like hate speech or disinformation or targeted misinformation, and things that, while potentially an enormous problem and having an enormous effect on our democracy, are not in themselves necessarily illegal or not illegal in all contexts. That was one of the issues with the original CDA. It was looking at restricting kind of harmful to minors content, which at the end of the day was also lawful and constitutional for adults to access. So it's something I think Congress needs to really keep clear. There's a lot, and this is something CDT advocates on all the time. We want to see companies doing content moderation because we know some kind of moderation is essential for an online service to be usable. We need spam to be addressed, but we also need everything from harassing and hateful commentary to just off-topic commentary to be addressed, depending on what kind of service you're talking about, what kind of online discussion space you're in. So content moderation has this huge role in making online spaces usable and in addressing abuse, but Congress needs to stay focused on its purview, which is really a much narrower category of illegal speech, illegal content.
So I think, Emma, you kind of raise in your comments, I think raises questions about industry best practices and whether it makes sense. I'm not saying that industry should regulate itself per se, but wouldn't it be helpful if there were some standards, right? Like, some, standards and practices like you have in broadcasting, right? Where maybe a small platform could say, okay, this is the industry standard. And maybe you tie it to Section 230, maybe you don't, we don't have to discuss that today, but would this kind of either a standards body or just industry coming up with its own, and again, the industry that has resources tends to be the big guys, but it just seems to me that having some sort of norms in this space would be helpful. Does anybody want to weigh in on that to start talking?
I mean, I can weigh in.
Go ahead, Christy.
We think there is a role, I think, for industry best practices that are voluntary, that are, not enforced necessarily by the government. I think that creates concern, at least for my boss and I think for many others. But just like there have been working groups set up and established to think about, best practices as it relates to cybersecurity or even privacy, it seems like there are operational tools that are available and can be discussed about how each company does its own content moderation, in a broader sense. And I think that it would also be helpful for smaller providers who are just getting up off the ground, but to be able to tap into some of these existing resources and existing information that have, that the bigger providers have, found as they've tried to implement it for their own platforms. So I think an opportunity to share information, in a best practices working group would be a helpful thing. I would just caution against tying something to those implementation of those best practices overall.
And does anybody else want to weigh in on that
I'd add just one quick thing. So I think there's a tremendous room for best practices, especially just regarding process. Having standardized practices about which lawful but offensive speech you take down starts, that gets complicated for the reasons that Emma mentioned. But the one thing I would just flag is, I really agree with Christy. There's a huge amount of room for better information sharing so that smaller platforms can be more effective in content moderation and enforcing their own chosen rules. The thing we want to really look out for there is to make sure there isn't just a one-way flow where Facebook decides that something is prohibited and then that gets added, say, to a hash database like the GiveCT database for extremist content, and smaller platforms just do what Facebook did because they don't have the resources to make their own new decision. We don't want to make incumbents even more powerful through having their policies and decisions effectively pushed out to their smaller competitors.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Representative Cox. Why don't you speak first and Emma, okay? Go ahead.
Just an additional flourish on this conversation, and that is that best practices that are best practices arrived at in the private sector have a different constitutional status than best practices that are guided in federal legislation or perhaps by the Department of Justice or the FCC. In the latter case, in a criminal matter, there are Fourth Amendment issues that would arise. Right now, whatever content moderation occurs in the private sector and using sex trafficking and child exploitation as the example makes the point clearly. When these leads, if you will, in criminal cases are turned over by the private sector to the government, there's not a Fourth Amendment issue. But if the government is involved, then it is no longer a voluntary private effort. And the criminal defendants would have an argument that they could exclude the very best evidence that should send them behind bars from that criminal prosecution. So I think we have to be very careful when we talk about best practices to specify which it is we're talking about. We're talking about the private sector, or we're talking about the government.
Emma, great point.
Just plus one to that, and to Daphne's point, she mentioned the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. I think it's a really good case study of looking at kind of what an industry best practice forum designed to do exactly this kind of information sharing from large companies to smaller under-resourced companies. GiveCT has been going on for a little over 3 years now, but it's also a good reminder that the conversations we're having here in the US about what we think should happen to Section 230 and what we think these primarily US-based companies should be doing with content moderation are not contained just to American borders. These are global conversations, and one of the dynamics we've seen worldwide is that this industry best practice initiative has become a focal point for advocacy from governments around the world as well, including many of the United States' close allies, like the United Kingdom and New Zealand and France. But it has taken what looks like a totally voluntary industry best practice forum that didn't even necessarily have a specific legal existence. Now GiveCT is a independent nonprofit organization, has an executive director, has governments on an advisory committee. It's becoming much more formalized, and so I think is something to pay a lot of attention to. What is the potential evolution of different kinds of approaches to best practices, because governments around the world are also having these same legislative discussions themselves.
So we've largely been talking about the legislative approaches, and of course the president has decided to put his thumb on the scale and has asked the Commerce Department to petition the Federal Communications Commission to basically make its own interpretation, I assume limiting interpretation of Section 230 because of perceived conservative bias, and I'll I'll tell you my bias. There's no such evidence, but whatever. And there's been a proceeding. I think reply comments already been filed, right? And there's also a lawsuit. And CDT was the first to bring the lawsuit. So I want to turn it back over to you, Emma, to talk a little bit about, why did you file so early? That was a kind of surprise to me. And I felt like such a fool because the press kept calling me as soon as the executive order came out and says, is it going to be a lawsuit? I said, no, it's too early. And then you guys filed it the next day. So I had egg on my face. So tell me why you filed it so early and what did you argue?
Sure, yeah. So for a little bit of background for folks, the president issued an executive order on social media in late May, and CDT filed our lawsuit in the district court for DC in early June. And part of why we filed so quickly is because what we are doing is challenging the executive order as a whole. There are a lot of different parts of the executive order that have dubious legal footing. The NTIA petition to the FCC for rulemaking on Section 230, where there's now hundreds, possibly thousands of pages of comments about the lack of the FCC jurisdiction to do that, but also things like asking every federal agency to provide updates on their advertising budgets with different social media platforms and asking OMB to conduct an analysis of the viewpoint bias in how different services decide how to do content moderation. There's a lot of different stuff in the executive order, but taking the order as a whole, we see it really very clearly as an effort from the president to have a coercive, chilling effect on how social media companies in particular are doing content moderation, especially around issues like misinformation about where and how to vote, and responding to disinformation on their platforms. And ultimately, because it is this coercive effort from the president, it deprives people of their ability to access free and open platforms for their speech. So we thought it was important to act quickly because that chilling effect doesn't require any particular proceeding to go underway before it starts to happen. It is a clear signal from the president that he is going to throw everything he can at social media services that have the temerity to include links to accurate information alongside content that he posts, and a clear signal to anybody who cares about having access to free and open platforms that the president is going to be basically pressuring services to do content moderation the way he sees fit and not the way that they see fit. So we thought it was important to get that message out quickly to try to help counter that chilling effect, but also because we think the court needs to step in and, and say that this executive order as a whole, this is not how we have these really important conversations. We've had lots of discussions here about what Congress could do. There's plenty more that we could get into the weeds of how communications governance in the United States can and should look, but threats from the president is not the way to go about it.
What is the status right now? And there's been another lawsuit filed, correct?
Yes, that's right. Electronic Frontier Foundation, Free Press, Rock the Vote, and a couple of other organizations have recently filed a lawsuit in California, which is great, and we're looking forward to seeing how that one plays out too. So we've filed our response to the government's motion to dismiss of our suit, and so we are waiting to hear back from the court on that.
So I just want to ask Congressman Cox, did you intend the FCC to be the arbiter to interpret Section 230? Was that your intent? It is in the Communications Act, as you reminded us.
Yeah, hardly. On the House floor during debate on the legislation, repeatedly, I said we do not want the FCC to stand for Federal Computer Commission. We don't want the federal government, whether it's the Department of Justice, FCC, or whomever, to be in this business. That was the Exxon model, and literally the purpose of our legislation was to counter that. And so it is interesting to me to read the NTIA petition, which has recast the legislative history 180 degrees and said that, it's clear from the legislative history that the FCC was given a role here. There's nothing in the statute that says so, and indeed the policy, which is written into the statute, it's the preamble, it makes it very clear that there was a deregulatory mindset behind what became Section 230, and nowhere did Congress express any intent of giving the FCC authority to interpret the statute through rule.
Yes, the ironies of conservatives wanting to broaden the FCC's authority, and it's particularly that deregulatory language, of course, was used to repeal net neutrality. But I won't get into that. I don't want to be sore about that. I want to see if anybody else, Christy or Daphne, wanted to weigh in on that. Okay, then I'm going to ask my final question. So where do the debates over Section 230 end? And content moderation. I mean, is this an issue like net neutrality that we're going to be debating in 15 years? Or, you know, does this, are we going to be in maybe in the next couple of years or maybe the next year? Where does it end, if ever? So I think I'm going to start with you, Emma, and I'll go backwards. Go ahead.
It's interesting. For the benefit of kind of our legal system, I hope we can get to some clarity and stability of a legal framework at some point. You know, I hope we're not constantly kind of seeing a Congress trying to revisit or amend or expand or carve out Section 230, because I think that will have genuinely a totally discouraging impact on anybody who's looking to kind of get in the game of content hosting and maybe being an alternative to some of the gigantic dominant platforms today. But in a way, I think we are always going to have conversations about content moderation because it's a dynamic set of challenges that we're going to be responding to. We're talking about people's speech. We're talking about people's communication, and people will change in response to whatever the environment is. Different issues will become hot or less prevalent. Different ways of complying with rules or circumventing rules will be created by infinitely creative people. And so I think we're always going to need to see flexibility in whatever the framework looks like, because the threats and the challenges and even just the kind of annoying problems will continue to shift and change.
Daphne?
Yeah, I'm with Emma. Well, the second part of what she said, this debate's not going to end, you know, any more than the debate about speech or human behavior generally and what's appropriate will ever end, because almost the whole world of human behavior and misbehavior has moved online, and it's all moderated by private platforms or mediated by private platforms and could be moderated by private platforms. We'll never agree about what they should do. And then beyond that, hopefully, the platforms themselves will evolve and change. So we'll be talking about different technologies and different business models. And so I don't see this conversation ending, but I do hopefully see us moving towards sort of a shared understanding of the framework and the questions of moderation at scale and the capabilities or lack thereof of automated technologies to moderate speech for us. So I think we will get smarter about the questions, but we're not going to reach consensus about the solutions.
I think it would help if we had more competition too, but that's my hobby horse. Go ahead, Christy.
So I think it could go on for years and years, like the debate around net neutrality has, but you know, I don't think it has to. I think Congress needs to take a hard substantive look at the law and think about the benefits of Section 230 and target the problems that they really want to try to solve and focus solutions on that. I think providing some more accountability and transparency, as I had mentioned, that what we tried to do in the Pact Act is one way to solve them. But I also think, as I mentioned at the top of this call, there are issues that are not related to Section 230 that people like to lump into Section 230. So I think in addition to coming up with a Section 230 solution, there are other things happening online related to privacy, potentially competition, that Congress also needs to take a look at. And it might be, tweaks in several different areas of law that will make consumers feel like they have more power online, which is really what I think the Section 230 debate is about, really. So, and I'm hopeful that Congress will be able to do it.
And Congressman, I'll give you the last word.
Well, this is bad. If I'm wrapping up or batting cleanup, I want to take the opportunity to say that this was a splendid conversation about a very important topic. And I think we've all learned from listening to one another that there are a lot of, if not intractable issues involved here that will keep us discussing and debating this topic ad infinitum, then, you know, deeply important issues that, if they can be resolved, deserve resolution. Because what's most important is that the 200 million, and there are 200 million websites active and available to all of us on the internet in the United States right now, the 200 million websites that are regulated under Section 230, you know, come in a different clothing and different variety, each from the other. They need some certainty. And so letting people know in advance the standard to which they're to conform their conduct is very important. There is a temptation when you're writing law, and so this is really a comment addressed to Congress, to go after the particular problem of the day. And what we've heard here is the problems of the day are going to change, you know, down the road, because we're talking about speech. But there's a temptation to say, I'm going to solve the problem with very specific language, almost regulatory in nature. And I'm going to mention technological solutions. I'm going to talk about algorithms. I'm going to talk about, you know, artificial intelligence. I'm going to get down in the weeds and say, if you do this, then that. We will be much wiser if our object is to provide certainty over the long term, if we stick to principles of law, which can be applied from one generation to the next, and allow technology to move forward without having lawyers say, well, we've got to use the technology mentioned in the statute, else we don't know what standard we will be held to. And so I think that if we do that, that we can perhaps make at least the legal side, the lawmaking side of this discussion, you know, come to some conclusion, some resolution, and it won't have to be perennial.
Well, that's a wonderful way to close. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, panelists. This was a terrific conversation.